Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. Today, we're going to be taking a brief interlude from the Battlecry series of videos that I've been making. Why is that? Well, I wanted to make a video about the Guardian. And then there's this notion that before the Guardian comes out, the only worthwhile tank in the game, or at least the best tank in the game, is the Champion. And thus the Guardian needs to be measured up against the Champion, and if it can't be exactly as good as the Champion in exactly the way the Champion is good, it's not a very good tank. And I have to say, this is a place where I think I fundamentally disagree with the community at large. I think there are lots of different ways to tank in this game. But the problem is, I can't address the Guardian without first addressing tanking as a whole. I need to explain why I think there are many good tanks in this game, and not just the Champion, before I can even start talking about why I think the Guardian is a good tank. Otherwise, any arguments I make explaining why the Guardian is a good tank are just gonna fall on deaf ears. So this is sort of me getting into what I think the fundamentals of tanking are in Pathfinder and what makes a good tank, a bad tank, and what makes a tank better in one party over another. Let's get into it. Now, before talking about the Champion, the Guardian, or any tank in Pathfinder, I wanted to talk about tanking as a concept in general. It's a confusing subject with a lot of nuances depending on the exact medium you're trying to interact with. Oftentimes, you can't even get a room full of people to agree on what makes a tank, so let alone getting them all to agree on all the nuances behind it. On the broadest level, completely agnostic of tabletop role-playing games, I think we can all agree that a tank does two things. First, they need to be a highly survivable character. They need to be some combination of hard to hit, hard to pin down, capable of shrugging off blows, etc. And secondly, they need the ability to attract aggro. Aggro meaning the attention of an enemy, the ability to convince enemies to focus on them. This puts enemies in a situation where you are pretty hard to kill and you're not letting them kill your friend. And that's kind of the crux of tanking. This is how a tank differs from a character that's just more of a support or a controller, because you can defensively support your allies without being a tank. But if you're doing both of these things, everyone's gonna agree that you're a tank. Now, tabletop role-playing game tanking is not like video game tanking. When you play a video game, if you're playing it against the computer, the AI, there's usually some set of actions you can take that will deterministically make that AI focus on you. In an RPG, there might be an aggro meter. In a turn-based game, there might just be pathfinding tricks you can use, etc. Even in a player versus player setting, though, you can still utilize the interface and various crowd control abilities to ensure that you get to tank. I have played games where when I'm playing a tanking character, I physically get to take someone's camera and turn them towards me so they can no longer aim at my friends. So TTRPG tanking is not like that. First, NPCs are typically controlled by a living, breathing, intelligent human being. This human being, the game master, always has the ability to use tactics if they're appropriate to the situation and appropriate to the character. You can never really predict exactly what they're going to do and force them to do that. And there's nothing resembling a interface, like I mentioned for the player versus player case, where I could turn an enemy's camera towards me. There's no interface like that that you can use to exploit your GM's attention. And then the second factor is that even if it were possible to implement something that forces the GM to focus on you, that's typically frowned upon in tabletops. It's considered too gamey. Even tabletops that are okay embracing the gaminess, like Draw Steel and D&D 4th edition, oftentimes shy away from mechanics that do directly say, you must hit me. They might have a mechanic that's something like, I mark an enemy, and that marked enemy is incapable of attacking friends without some penalty or some punishment. But they will never fully take away the choice of the NPC to attack your friends, because that's seen as too gamey. And finally, roles just aren't that discreetly defined in tabletops. Sometimes You'll have multiple tanks in a party. Sometimes you'll have many damage dealers. Sometimes you'll have multiple healers. Crowd control and tanking can have a lot of overlap. Because roles are fluid and dynamic and more of a spectrum than they are in video games, it can be hard to even pin down what makes a tank or what constitutes as tanking. So how do tanks operate in Pathfinder and in other tactical tabletop role-playing games? Because we do have tanks, and it's not just the champion, as I keep saying. The crux of what they do is offer enemies dilemmas. Your whole goal when you're tanking is, I am very hard to hit, but here's a very good reason to still be hitting me. There isn't an aggro bar that you can fill out and force enemies to hit you, but what you can do is give them really shitty choices between hitting you and hitting somebody else whom you have done the due diligence of protecting. Effectively, tanking boils down to hit me, or else something really bad is going to happen to you. Something that'll let me protect my friend. Let's get into how that works now. Now, let's talk a little bit about the sorts of dilemmas that you can offer while tanking in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. At a baseline, the most rudimentary dilemma you can offer your foes is hit me, or I hit you. Now, of course, this is not a very convincing dilemma in a lot of cases. It'll always work on mindless foes, and it'll probably work on emotionally charged foes that are not particularly tactical, like say a pack of starving hyenas or bandits. But anytime you fight something that has decent combat capabilities, even say a pack of wolves, they're smart enough to understand that just because someone carrying a shield and a sword is standing close to you and hitting you doesn't mean they're the first person you should hit. Intelligent foes can always make tactical considerations. Is there someone who's particularly squishy? Is there someone who's healing the rest of the party? Is the really tanky character quite slow and incapable of chasing me around? All of these can come together and make this a very unconvincing form of tanking. You will often see this suggested as a method of tanking under people asking for advice on how to tank, but realistically, at most tables, it's not gonna feel like tanking. It's gonna feel like being a damage dealer who is tanky, but you're not actually doing much to protect your friends. When evaluating a tank in Pathfinder, you should see how strong of a dilemma it can create. As I said, the hit me or I hit you is not a very strong dilemma, but once you get into those stronger dilemmas, tanking becomes a convincing and powerful role within the game. So why is the champion considered the best tank, and by many, the only worthwhile tank? It's because they offer an incredible dilemma. Their dilemma says, hit me, but if you hit my friend, I will both reduce the damage you did and punish you in some way. That punishment can be an extra hit. It can be enfeebled 2. It can be dazzled, or it can be the person you're attacking getting a free step. No matter the punishment though, there is a punishment attached, and there was a reduction in the damage you did in the first place. That's a really convincing dilemma. Intelligent enemies who hit the champion's friend and see how hard they whiffed because of it would be very strongly incentivized to hit the champion after. This makes the champion really good at tanking because, remember, the two roles that you're trying to fulfill are, I am survivable, I stop you from hitting my friends and force you to hit me, and the champion is pretty good at that. It's also worth noting that champions fit very well into parties that have access to burst healing. If there is, say, a cloistered cleric who casts a heal spell a lot in your party, it's very easy for somebody with that spell to heal one person on whom you're letting the enemy deal a controllable amount of damage. Let's say your party looks something like champion, rogue, cloistered cleric, and wizard. The wizard is really far back and unlikely to be taking too much damage. If you as the champion reduce the damage that we done to a rogue, then regardless of whether you get hit or the rogue gets hit, your cleric is going to have an easy time. You will notice that people often assume that there is burst healing available, that it's even a mandatory role, and that sort of feeds into the narrative that the champion is the best tank. Because if you assume burst healing is mandatory, then the tank that makes the burst healer's life most easy is the best tank. Of course, not every party is going to have access to burst healing, and as I get later into this video, I will talk about how other tanks fit different party compositions better. On top of that, champions are excellent against single boss enemies. If a boss moves up to you and then tries hitting your friend, and let's say they crit and you deny a chunk of damage to them, suddenly the boss is not scary anymore. They have one action left. That action has a multiple attack penalty. They're probably not gonna crit. They also just ate a debuff or punishment of some kind. So either they lost some health, they got dazzled, they got enfeebled, whatever. They're no longer as scary. So champions excel against single boss enemies. And just like with the burst healing assumption, there is an assumption in the community that single boss enemies are the thing you need to optimize around. That multi-enemy fights are always easy, though that's not true at higher levels. That's only really true at low levels. But because that assumption has embedded itself in the community perception, that's yet another reason the champion gets favored as the best tank. And finally, the champion does have excellent features that supplement its tanking. It has Lay on Hands to make sure it's giving that little bit of healing nudge that somebody might need in case the damage reduction is not enough. And instead of Lay on Hands, you could have Shield of the Spirit, which quite directly boosts your allies' AC. So overall, the champion is considered the best tank because, one, it does have an excellent kit for tanking, of course it does, but two, there's a set of assumptions that are embedded into the online discourse that sort of favor the champion inherently. Assumptions about healing and boss fights make it so the champion looks better than other tanks. I also wanted to point out something a little interesting. The way that the tank causes a dilemma has a bit of crossover with other roles. This can be any of the other roles in a party. It can be damage dealer, healer, and you'll see some of those crossovers as I go through this video. In the case of the champion, it's damage mitigation. A champion in the front line is filling out a very similar niche to, say, a druid in the back casting Hidebound a lot, or a bard in the back using Rallying Anthem a lot. They're directly mitigating the damage that's coming in, and that is how they create the dilemma. All tanks cross over into one of the other roles as they create their dilemma, and that sort of helps inform what sort of a party composition you will fit in. Because the champion's dilemma comes from damage mitigation, that's why they pair so well with burst healers, and that's why they excel against single boss enemies. But with all of that being said, is the champion really the only good tank? If you've been paying attention to the video at all, you know I'm gonna say no. So let's get into some of these others. The first category of tanks that I wanted to talk about was action denial tanks. These are tanks that say, hit me, or you will waste way too many actions trying to hit my friends. This is usually done via athletics. Being prone doubles the action cost of diving your friends in the backline, and it also might trigger reactions, which is a lot of value and disincentivizes diving the squishies. Being grabbed will also double the action cost, and the escape attempt inflicts map, which means now the enemy is less accurate against those squishies and less likely to crit. Shove can clear enemies out of their ideal positioning. You might move them out of flanking. You might move them out of reach where their reactions are threatening a friend. You might move them out of a choke point where they have blocked off your friend. So athletics is usually a cornerstone of these builds. Now I want to be clear, any tank can use athletics. The champion I talked about earlier is capable of just having a shield and an empty hand, or having a shield with, say, the shove and trip augmentation, and just using those tools whenever needed. And the same is true for tanks I'll talk about later. All tanks can make use of athletics to some degree to intensify the dilemmas that they force enemies into. That being said, a tank that is dedicated to action denial, it's something else entirely. And I will show a build at the end of the slide to explain what I mean. Notably, when we talk about crossing over of roles between tanks and other roles, the action denial tank is crossing over with the role of a battlefield controller. But remember, you're not exactly a battlefield controller. The wizard that's standing in the back is not using control the same way you are. The wizard wants to make sure anyone who gets hit, whether it be themselves or you or anyone else in the party, is just taking as few as inefficient hits as possible. You don't have the tools to do quite that. What you're doing is giving the same fundamental dilemma a tank offers. Hit me, or I'll make it expensive to hit my friends. This kind of build pairs really well with parties that are heavy on the ranged or skirmishing role. This is because you want to make sure that you're not providing the enemy with good targets. If there is a squishy frontliner that's not you, the enemy will just hit them. If they're prone, they might not even stand up. They'll just accept the -2 and hit your friend. If they're grabbed, they might just hit your friend anyways. And especially if there's someone who is standing in the back, but is still forced to stand pretty close to combat, like a bard or an elemental sorcerer or a silent snow witch. This is really powerful. This is a really good way of protecting them. It also works with a squishy frontliner if they're willing to skirmish. If they're willing to dive out of combat when things start looking dicey, suddenly they're giving you back the ability to protect them because they're standing at range. If they're willing to switch to their backup weapon when this happens too, they're giving you even more of an ability to do so. So just like the champion had an ideal party it paired with, one that had a lot of burst healing that could be concentrated on whoever the enemy wanted to focus fire, this pairs really well when there is a significant amount of ranged combat or skirmishing combat happening in your party. An example of such a tank is the monk. And of course, as I mentioned, athletics is going to be a cornerstone of this build. Flurry of maneuvers means for one action, you can try to trip multiple foes. Mixed maneuver means for 2 actions, you can ignore the multiple attack penalty and really try to lock down one foe. But it's not just athletics. Standstill gives you a reaction that can disrupt an enemy trying to get away from you, even if you fail to successfully lock them down with athletics. Tangled Forest Stance can make it really awkward to get to your friends, especially if combined with other controlling options that the rest of your party may have access to. This is sort of what I meant that while athletics is a tool any tank can use and every tank should consider using it, it's really different when a tank has dedicated themselves to action denial. A champion using athletics might grapple a foe or two over the course of a combat. The monk using athletics is going to make the GM feel bad if they want to approach their friends. The monk also has the ability to participate in the kiting whenever they need to. This can be sort of an advanced tactic, but say your friends have proactively positioned themselves 40 or more feet away. You can stride into combat, use flurry of maneuvers to get a couple of enemies prone, etc., and then you stride out. And now you are pretty expensive for them to hit, and your friends are virtually impossible for them to focus fire. And that creates a multi-layered front line. You're mitigating damage both to yourself and to your friends, while also just fundamentally being a tank. Even if you were next to the enemies, you still have a very high AC and saving throws. So action denial tanks just all around pair really well if you have a party that knows how to abuse its mobility. Notably, monks are the best users of fortress shields for this reason, because they have so much mobility that even with the speed penalty, they will probably still be the fastest characters on the battlefield. And finally, something important to note, this monk is actually better at handling larger groups of enemies than a champion would be. The champion, of course, excels against single enemies. The monk is good against them, especially if the party is using their skirmishing and ranged options effectively, because grappling and knocking enemies prone is good against bosses, but the champion doesn't need that coordination to protect their friends from that boss. They just have a reaction that blunts the impact of 1/3 of the boss's actions. So champions are better against single boss enemies, but monks are way better against large groups of enemies. If there are 4 or 5 enemies on the battlefield, you can run up to them, trip 2 of them with flurry of maneuvers. Your tangled forest stance might make it really, really hard for the rest to get to your friends, and your standstill means anyone who gets away from you risks having that disrupted. All in all, you can divide and conquer a battlefield single-handedly. If there's 5 or 6 foes, you can take on 2 to 3 of them at once and tell the rest of your party to take on the remaining 2 to 3. This is the sort of capability that a very traditional tank like the champion doesn't have. And remember, at higher levels, multi-enemy fights tend to be some of the more dangerous ones. Single boss fights get easier as you level up. Multi-enemy fights get more and more dangerous. The monk can really alleviate the need for debuff and control spells in a party they're in by virtue of just being such a good action denial tank. So that overall is how action denial tanks operate, and one specific build that I really like. I have even seen this monk build in action, and I've seen it work really well, so I'm saying all this from experience. Action denial tanking works really well in a ranged heavy party. The next category of tank is probably the simplest category of tanks in the game, Healbot Tanks. Hit me or else I'll heal my friends, and then nothing you did will have mattered. This is sort of the spiritual inverse of the champion. The champion is designed to proactively position themselves and mitigate damage that's coming in. In that sense, I would call them mitigation tanks, if we're going to give them a category the way we've done for action denial tanks and Healbot tanks. And then Healbot tanks are the opposite of these mitigation tanks. Rather than proactively preventing damage, they're reacting to the enemy's damage and then healing it away. This obviously crosses over with the role of a healer, and I have noticed people saying that they don't really consider these to be tanks. For example, they wouldn't consider a War Priest Cleric to be a tank. They consider them to be pure healers. Roles in TTRPGs are not that discrete. Roles tend to be fluid, and characters usually fill multiple roles out at a time. And the same roles often filled by multiple characters at a time. In my opinion, if you are a survivable character and you're somehow able to offset your allies' survivability and incentivize enemies to attack you, you're a tank. And I know from GMing for a party with a War Priest Cleric that Healbot tanks are tanks, because oftentimes I feel like I'm in a situation where I have to hit the War Priest or nothing's gonna matter. Naturally, this is going to pair well with parties that are lacking in burst healing options. Again, kinda like the spiritual inverse of the champion. Mitigating damage works well in a party that's already good at doing burst healing. In a party that's not already good at doing burst healing, you want to be a burst healer who's also so tanky that you going down is not a risk. So for example, you might bring a champion to a party that looks like, say, Cloistered Cleric, Wizard, and Frontline Rogue. But you might bring a War Priest Cleric to a party that looks something like Frontline Barbarian, Backline Ranger, and Backline Druid, who is not a healer. So just like with action denial tanks, there are just parties you fit better into, and there are parties that other tanks fit better into. The example build for this is, if you haven't guessed by now, the War Priest Cleric. You will pick options like Healing Font, Emblazoned Armament, Raise Symbol, etc. All of these will improve your healing capability and make you really tanky. You will also have access to divine spells like Benediction, Share Life, etc. to supplement the protection you give your allies. This will give you some capacity to proactively reduce damage your allies take, and thus not need to rely on burst healing as much. The War Priest Cleric is going to be a lot more reactive than either of the other two tanks we have talked about. Yes, options like Benediction and Share Life exist, but they're not as efficient to use as the champion's reaction, and their proactive use is not quite as combat dominating as good use of action denial is. This has an upside and a downside. The upside is that since you're reacting to things as they happen, you can more flexibly adapt to any kind of fight. For example, the champion may find themselves in a position where they were just simply not able to fire off their reaction. The monk may find themselves in a position where it doesn't really matter what athletics maneuver you use, there's still a target nearby that the enemy can hit. This is much less likely to happen if all you're doing is letting your friends take the damage and then healing it back up when it happens, because there's just considerably less of a requirement or prerequisite on what you have to do. But the downside, of course, is that since you're reacting, this risks falling into a negative spiral of some kind. Not necessarily a death spiral, because a competent party will rarely find themselves death spiraling, but you might find yourself overexpending resources, for example. You might find that one of your friends ended up on the ground prone before you got a chance to heal them. You might find that you spent a lot of time healing yourself in combat and thus didn't really participate too much in combat directly. So that is the downside of being so reactive. Being reactive means you're sort of slave to the randomness of the die and slave to the tactics of the enemies. Anything they do can directly impact your effectiveness and your sustainability. That concludes our talk about the Healbot tanks. The final category of tanks I wanted to talk about is spike damage tanks. Their dilemma is simple. Hit me, or I give you a huge hit. Now remember, this is not just hit me or I hit you. I already mentioned earlier that simply hitting enemies is not enough to convince them to hit you. You can't just be a sword and board fighter, because in any competent adventuring party, all of the party members are threats, and an intelligent enemy will recognize that and prioritize easier targets than you. You need to be a spike damage dealer to meaningfully draw aggro from your enemies. Spike damage differs from continuous damage in that it is sudden and it feels random and it is impossible to react to once it's actually landed. Continuous damage is what your party uses to make sure that a combat is going to end in a reasonable turns to kill, TTK. Let's say your typical TTK is 4 to 6 turns. Spike damage is what suddenly makes that 3 turns, or even 2 turns. Spike damage is what looks at a multi-enemy fight and suddenly takes one of them out of combat. Once an enemy knows that you can deal a significant chunk of spike damage, you become a huge priority. Think about how much likelier enemies are to hit a barbarian, even one that's not giant instinct, so no penalty to AC or anything involved, than they are to hit a fighter. The barbarian's big, scary amount of damage that happens every time they focus anyone draws a lot of aggro. Partly, this might just be an emotional response from the GM, but partly it's an optimal response to recognize that a spike damage dealer is a real threat. Naturally, this has crossover with the role of being a damage dealer. That should not need any elaboration. That means that it pairs well with a party full of generalists. If the rest of your party is not picking out discrete roles, then you can just be a damage dealer that also happens to be a good tank that protects them. If the rest of your party, say, splits the burden of healing among 1 or 2 or 3 party members using scrolls and battle medicine, etc. If it splits damage between multiple continuous damage dealers who have not heavily invested into damage. If control and debuffs and buffs are things that come from everyone, including spells, but also including demoralize and recall knowledge and other such stuff. When everyone's doing a mix of these options, you playing a spike damage tank can be really valuable because suddenly you're providing this unpredictable element that can take enemies out of combat, that can shorten the lifespans of bosses, and if they react to your spike damage, if they focus you, there's now a fully functional party of generalists that can adapt to the situation and just take the enemies out. And if they focus those allies of yours, your spike damage is going to pull the fight back in your favor. So spike damage tanks pair incredibly well with parties of generalists. The example build for this is a Sparkling Targe Magus. Unlike the other 2 options I showed so far, I'm not going to talk about any specific feats required to make this build tick. You get everything you need from being a Sparkling Targe Magus. Your Hybrid Study gives you the Shielded Strike focus spell, which will single-handedly let you make a strike, raise a shield, or cast a shield cantrip, and it'll recharge your spell strike. Excellent action compression. Your Arcane Cascade stance is going to add your shield bonus to your saving throws. And of course, as a Magus, you have Spell Strike. That is your spike damage. That's the thing that once you have walked up to an enemy and done 50 damage at level 3 or whatever, they're now scared that they're going to do that again, and they're considering focusing you instead of focusing your squishier friends. I will also take a moment here to note that Maguses, melee ones especially, really should not just be trying to spam Spell Strike as frequently as possible. In my experience, Maguses tick best when you have a sequence of actions where you Spell Strike roughly once every 2 turns, sometimes even once every 3 turns if you really have other things to do. As a Targe Magus, you really want to try fitting in that Arcane Cascade ASAP. You might want to cast buff spells. You want to be making sure to raise your shield and or using Shielded Strike whenever possible. And that means not always spell striking. But that's okay, because as a spike damage tank, the actual spell strikes you do are less important than the threat of that spell strike. As long as that threat exists, you're still going to draw aggro, you're still going to feel like a tank, and you'll still probably get to use plenty of spell strikes and do tons of spike damage along the way. You can supplement your tankiness and your party's tankiness with spells like Hidebound, 4th rank Invisibility, Mountain Resilience, etc. The Arcane list is generally really good at mitigating incoming damage, and even with your limited spell slots, you will find that you can do a good job at this. Remember to save your spell slots for the scariest fights of a day. If you're in a fight and you have the feeling that you can get through with just focus spells and cantrips, get through with just focus spells and cantrips. That's what you're designed to do. Spell slots are reserved for either really, really difficult fights or really, really bad situations, like bad luck, or narrative beats that led you into a bad position, or maps that are really unfavorable for your party, or enemies that hard counter your party in some sense. Make sure to preserve your spell slots for those harder situations and to otherwise operate off of cantrips and focus spells, because that's all you really need. Your big upside here is that you're not really occupying a party slot as a tank. In a lot of the other tanks I talked about, you're sort of thinking about the rest of your party and then carving out what you are, and then you're occupying a slot there. The War Priest is kind of occupying both the slot of the tank and the healer. You're not doing anything like that as the Magus. You're simply a damage dealer, and everyone's a damage dealer. You just happen to be a really good tank along the way. This is the upside I was talking about earlier, where if they focus you, there's a full self-contained party that can deal with the enemies. And if they don't focus you, now you're a scary spike damage dealer. And that's the big upside of spike damage tanks. It doesn't take a lot of build effort or coordination for your build to tick. The downside, of course, and this is Magus specific, is that your action economy can just be quite hard to manage. And that does make you disruptible. If you're knocked prone, you're going to feel real bad. If you're stunned or slowed, you're going to feel real bad. These are genuine downsides that a Magus tank is going to have to deal with. This is also part of why I said you cannot be planning to spell strike every single turn. If you're losing an action on a turn, it's really hard to be spell striking that turn. But if your plan wasn't to spell strike every single turn, it's not going to feel as bad when you're disrupted. But that disruption will still be a downside. You still have a somewhat clunky action economy that requires lots of careful sequencing. That's it for spike damage tanks, and that is it for discussing other tanks before the Guardian. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list. There are other athletics tanks like reach weapon fighters. There are other spike damage tanks like barbarians that don't have the giant instinct. There are plenty of ways to tank in this game. There are plenty of ways to be a really good tank in this game. And the specific build you make will have various upsides and downsides depending on party composition and enemy composition. All of that to say, the champion is not the only tank in the game. Now, with all of that context in mind, with the understanding that the champion is not the only tank, there's many ways to tank in Pathfinder, now we can evaluate the Guardian. The Guardian has an incredibly strong tanking dilemma. In my opinion, the strongest dilemma in the game. Hit me, or else I will stop you from focus firing. This is the signature reaction of the Guardian. Intercept attack. If an ally within 10 feet of you takes physical damage, or 15 feet if the enemy doing the damage had been taunted before by you, then you can simply take the damage for them. This is a unique ability. There are ways to split the damage with allies. There is Protector's Sacrifice. There is Share Life. There is Guardian's Aegis. All of these are good options. Unfocusing enemy fire is fundamentally good, because if the enemy wanted to deal 40 damage to one character and then deals 35 to one and 5 to the other, the damage does become less scary because of that. This is better than all of those abilities. You take all the damage away from the more fragile character. This doesn't look that strong on the surface, but it's the strongest tanking reaction in the game. Let's put it into context. Let's say you, as the Guardian, are standing next to someone significantly squishier than you, like a rogue or a wizard. The enemy strides up to that person that's near you, strikes them. Let's say it's a boss enemy for now. They crit your friend, you take that damage. You also have a passive resistance. I'll talk about the resistance more in my next video, but just trust me, Guardians have passive physical resist, so you resist a little bit of that damage too. Now what does the enemy do? Their original plan was to focus fire your friend, the rogue or the wizard. Crit them once, hit them a second time. Ideally, that friend is dropped. If they're not dropped, they're so low on health that now the party is pressured into spending actions on them. Maybe they move out of combat, or maybe somebody heals them, something along those lines. But you wasted that first crit. That crit went to your 12 HP body that also had passive physical resist. If they try to attack you now so that they still get to focus fire, they're not going to get to put pressure on the party. You're a 12 HP class. You're going to resist their follow-up hit too. And because of multiple attack penalty and your incredibly high AC, they might just miss. And they're definitely not even going to get to crit. With the other party member, they might have had a 10% chance of critting. With you, it's just a nat 20 or bust. So with one reaction, you have disrupted their ability to pressure your party. This is a staggeringly good reaction. Remember, when a champion uses their reaction, the enemy can still pressure your party. You have reduced the amount of pressure they would do by using champion's reaction, but you have not eliminated it. If you're planning on healing away the damage your friends take, you're always taking on the risk those friends go down first or get into a really bad situation first. If you're using athletics, there's a chance that you might fail to trip the boss or meaningfully slow them down before they get to hit your friend. And if you're a spike damage tank, the boss can just ignore you because they might just have the HP and or AC to survive multiple turns of your focus. The Guardian is the only class that using a single reaction will completely eliminate the threat the boss posed for a turn. And this is not unique to boss fights either. Eliminating focus fire is also an excellent way of stopping multiple enemies from ganging up on your squishy friend. Again, when the champion reduces the damage that one of the enemies, say 6 or 7 attacks, does, that's very different from what you get to do, which is wait for a really high damage attack to hit your friend and then just take it away from there. So I do consider Intercept Attack to be the best single tanking option in the game. Does that make the Guardian the single best tank in the game? Not necessarily. You can't just have one reaction to be the best. You have to look at the whole class, every feature, every feat, every option, and just evaluate them in context. And that is something we're going to have to do in the next video. My next video is going to be a deep dive into the Guardian, and we'll get into how effective of a tank the whole overall package is. It's just in this video, I wanted to first get out of the way that the champion was never the sole one and only tanking option. As a GM, as a player, I have seen so many other tanking options work. To say the champion was the only option is, in my opinion, a disservice to the variety Pathfinder has to offer. And now that we're all on the same page, now that we all understand what makes a good tank in Pathfinder, the next video will be evaluating the Guardian in context of all of the tanks we have, not just the champion. And I think that's going to make for a really fun video. I hope you found all of my arguments convincing. I hope I have convinced you that champions are not the only way to tank in the game, and that Guardians are not the only second way of tanking in the game. I hope you try out other options. I hope you look at some of these other builds if you're trying to build a tank character in the future. If you like my content, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you can, join a channel membership because it's the most direct way of supporting me without worrying about ads in any way. Otherwise, I'll see you next time with the Guardian video. Mathfinder out.